Welcome to Christianity on Trial. Today we're going to be talking about Jesus Christ and whether he is truly the fulfillment of Old Testament scriptures. Many argue that the Old Testament has messianic prophecies, prophecies which run throughout the Old Testament, which Christians claim are fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Jews do not claim that. In fact, most rabbis would disagree with the point, and so on Today in Christianity on Trial, we have in studio Dr. Will Varner, who is professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Master's College in Santa Clarita, California. Of his 3 master's degrees, one is from the Dropsy College, Dropsy Hebrew College in Philadelphia in Judaic Studies, and he has his doctorate from Temple University in Philadelphia. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Tom.
Thank you. Now you, although you do have a strong Jewish educational background, do hold to Jesus as being the fulfillment of the Old Testament messianic prophecies. Why don't you define for us what a messianic prophecy is?
Well, messianic comes from obviously the word Messiah, which means in the Hebrew anointed one. There were various individuals in the Old Testament who in their office or their function were anointed with oil. A prophet was anointed with oil, a priest, and a king. And they became anointed ones. You might say messiahs with a small m. And so the concept of the messianic prophecies is that there are definite predictions that predict that there will be one coming someday who will be an anointed prophet, an anointed priest, an anointed king, all in himself, combining all 3 of those functions. He will be the anointed one, or Hamashiach in Hebrew, or the Messiah, we would say in English. And so we believe that there's a succession of these prophecies, all developing the concept of this ultimate anointed prophet, priest, and king who would come. And as Christians, we believe that one is Jesus, the Messiah of Israel, and also the Savior of the world.
What we'll be doing on today's show is examining the Christian claims of whether Jesus of Nazareth is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, or in Judaic terms or in Jewish terms, whether Yeshua is the Hamashiach of the Tanakh. And what I'll be doing is putting Dr. Varner on the hot seat, if you will. I'll be challenging his claims with the appropriate Jewish response or the often rabbinic response to the Christian claims, so that you'll get an understanding of the debate, why there's disagreement, what the key issues are of the passages and the interpretive differences, which will allow you to make up your own mind to see whether you believe that Jesus is the Messiah long awaited by the Jews. I'll let Dr. Varner go ahead and make your case. Why don't you go and start and see where we go from here?
You know, Tom, we could begin right in the Tanakh itself, the Hebrew Bible, and that would be appropriate. But as a Christian, I will acknowledge that I come to the Old Testament with certain understanding of it that is filtered by my Christian understanding. I believe it's an informed Christian understanding, but nevertheless I am a Christian. Jesus said to his disciples in Luke 24 that it was necessary for him to suffer, and beginning at Moses, that is the Torah, and in all the prophets, that is the Nevi'im, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. That gives us what I would say is a paradigm for our approaching the Messianic prophecies, that these prophecies are part of one view that this Messiah would first come to suffer and then to reign, and the suffering would come before the reigning. So as we look back at the development of the Messianic prophecies, I think we must approach it in that way as a paradigm to understand them. Of course, the first prophecy would be Genesis 3:15, acknowledged by Jews and Christians alike as speaking of a coming one who would crush Satan's head. In the context of the promise to Adam and Eve, there is this statement to the serpent, who's representative of Satan, that I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He, that is the seed of the woman, will crush your head, and you will crush his heel. There, if I use a mixed metaphor, in seed form, is really the original plant of the entire branch or tree of Messianic prophecy, in a promise that someday Satan will be defeated by the descendant of the woman. At the same time that he, that is to say the woman, will defeat Satan, Satan will also inflict a wound on him. It says that Satan will crush or damage his heel. So there, in the first prophecy, which is really the mother of all prophecies, you might say, of messianic truth, is a statement that this one, in the process of defeating Satan, will have his heel injured. In other words, he will suffer. And so even from the first messianic prophecy, we have this idea of Messiah suffering, but also his ultimate triumph when he will render Satan powerless.
Now, you may argue that Jesus has defeated Satan, but let's take a look at the world today. Evil has not stopped. In fact, I think one of the greatest arguments against the Christian worldview is that there's so much suffering and evil when we have such a loving God spoken of in Christianity. Here it says that I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and his, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. We're speaking of bruising here. But the Christians seem to say that he will conquer and defeat. But even if this is a defeat, Jesus Christ has not defeated Satan. Evil is definitely not stopped in the world. How can you say then that this is the fulfillment fulfilled in Jesus when Satan has not been imprisoned or defeated?
It is certainly true that the end has not arrived. The final defeat and eradication of evil has not arrived. We fully acknowledge that. But the prophecy says that in the process of defeating Satan, his heel will be wounded. So we see that the wounding of the Messiah is a stage in that process of finally rendering Satan powerless. The book of Revelation in the New Testament does picture an end-time event when Satan himself will be cast into the lake of fire. That will be the final stage of this fulfillment. I think Jesus really said it when he provided that paradigm that it was necessary for the Messiah first to suffer and then to enter into his glory. So the suffering comes first and the glory comes second. And in the process, after the Messiah has been wounded, has suffered, in the process, the ultimate victory of Messiah over Satan will not take place until the end times.
Yeah, I would say also that the Jewish understanding of Messiah is that he's going to be a reigning king. Jesus definitely has not reigned, regardless of even if he has conquered or not. He is not reigning. He is not reigning. Israel has not been restored as a kingdom, and that is the expectation of the Messiah. Let's move on. I do know that we have quite a few verses, and I would say that this truly isn't the best to hold on to. Where would you take us from here in the Christian worldview?
Well, perhaps the best thing would to suggest an analogy of a painter doing a portrait. It would slowly develop with each brush stroke. Genesis 3:15 would be the first brush stroke. And I would suggest that the argument that Jesus is the Messiah is a cumulative argument, that there's a number of prophecies. The earlier ones, each one by itself, may not be the strongest argument to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, just like one or two strokes on a painting would not be enough to identify the person in the painting. So I would say that here's the initial prophecy. Then there are many developments of that prophecy throughout the scriptures of the whole Old Testament. And with each successive prophecy, another brushstroke is added to the portrait until I believe we can adequately recognize who is being painted. So I would suggest something like Genesis 49:10, which adds the information about this Messiah to the information that he'll come from a woman and Satan will be defeated. I would suggest that in Genesis 49:10 that Jacob says that in the tribe of Judah will come one who is called Shiloh. Some interpret that as one to whom the scepter belongs, and he will be in the tribe of Judah, and he will reign. He will be the legitimate king of Israel, and also unto him shall the gathering of the people be, the last part of Genesis 49:10 says, and that refers to the fact that not only will he have the right to be the king of Israel, but he will also have an appeal to the nations. The peoples of the world will begin to believe in him. So the added fact in that prophecy is that he will be from the tribe of Judah. And that's uniformly agreed by Jews and Christians alike, that the king of Israel will come from Judah. The problem is, since 70 CE, or AD, as Christians like to call it, the temple has been destroyed. The genealogical records have been destroyed, and no Jewish person today can even prove that they are from the tribe of Judah, or from Dan, or from Naphtali, or Asher for that regard. So if the Messiah has not come, how will Jewish people know that he's from the tribe of Judah, since all of the genealogical records have been destroyed? That he had to come when one could show that he was from the tribe of Judah, and Jesus did. Jesus came obviously before 70 AD. It's very clear he's from the tribe of Judah. He made that claim to be the Messiah of Israel. So my application of Genesis 49:10 to the argument would be, it teaches that the Messiah had to come before 70 AD, when the tribal genealogies were intact. Now the verse itself does not just scream out Jesus, but the verse itself does add to the argument that, number one, he should be from the tribe of Judah, and the application of that argument is, then this Messiah from the tribe of Judah, whoever he is, had to come while people could still trace their tribal genealogy.
Again, I'd say that you have two problems in the understanding of the verse. First of all, the scepter being taken away, meaning that their right to capital punishment and rule was taken from their kingdom, but that right was taken from their kingdom all the way back in 586 BC. So you have a 500-year gap, little under 400 some years, of no Messiah. So you have your first problem, and I'd say the second...
And no king for a while.
And no king.
And no king. But to respond to you, Tom, and I'll allow you to finish your point in just a minute, is that a king did return. During the time of the Herods, a king did return. There was a king ruling over Israel. As bad as he was morally, and we certainly don't hold him up as a model or example, Herod the Great was called the king of the Jews. And his grandson, Herod Agrippa I, died in 44 AD. He was called the king of the Jews. In other words, he died approximately 14 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So the scepter had not finally departed from Judah until 44 AD. Jesus came before 44 AD, and obviously he came before 70 AD, when tribal genealogies were still intact.
But doesn't Israel once again have scepter in hand?
Yes, but not as a king. Hosea 3:4-5 says that Israel will continue for a long time without a king and without a prince and without a priesthood, a functioning priesthood. We are living in that time when Israel is functioning without a king. There has been no king reigning in Israel, even with the restoration of the state. They don't claim to have a king.
That argues against you, because this person here, the Messiah, will be the king reigning. And you argue absence of a king. And I would say this passage argues the king coming and reigning. But you argue the absence of the king, which I think is that not demonstrating clearly that this person has not come. For he is not king and should be reigning.
Good point. The prophecy says, however, that the scepter, or the right to rule, will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. And another translation of that is, until he comes whose right it is. Jesus has the right to the scepter, but we are not saying that he is reigning as the king of Israel today, but he has that right. He has that legal right. He has that genealogical right. He fulfills the prophecies, so he has that right to rule. And as Christians, we believe that when he comes again, he will reign physically over this earth.
But that's not the messianic expectation of ancient Judaism. Is that the expectation, that he would not reign? Even after his resurrection in the book of Acts, we have the record of his post-resurrection appearances, and the apostles ask him, is it at this time that you will establish your kingdom? Even the apostles understood that the Messiah would establish his kingdom. And he didn't. And it has not happened, but that has been the expectation, the messianic expectation. Not that he would have the right, which he has always had. Has not God always had the right? So isn't it more logical that it is the enactment of the right the coming and the reigning, the restoring of the nation, the stopping of evil and destroying of Satan, not the Holocaust. Where is the reign if we're speaking of a reign of a Messiah? And how could Jesus be this fulfillment?
Jesus responded to their question there in Acts about will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel, not by denying that he wouldn't, but by saying it's not given to you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own power, but you go and be witnesses to me. We're not denying that in this interregnum or in this in-between period of time, between the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus, he is reigning spiritually, but he will come again to restore that kingdom to Israel. Jesus never denied that. As a matter of fact, he said to Caiaphas, henceforth you shall see me coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus said that he would come back someday, and he will take the scepter, and he will reign over Israel. That does not mean he does not have the right today. But what we argue for is this, that before he reigns physically over the earth, he must come to suffer. And he did come to suffer, and he qualified to be the Messiah. So during this period, this message about his death, burial, and resurrection, what Christians call the gospel, is going out to the nations of the world. And people are coming to believe in him. There must be time for that. And when that gospel goes out to the nations of the world, in God's own timing, when that's finished, his Son will come back and will reign over a redeemed earth, when swords will be beat into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and he will reign over Israel and the nations.
In case you just joined us, what we're doing today is examining the Christians' claims of Jesus of Nazareth being the fulfillment of the Old Testament Messiah, the awaited one of the Jews, the Messiah to come. In studio is Dr. Will Varner, and I'm putting him on the proverbial hot seat on Christianity on Trial, and we will examine his claims, and I will be responding to his claims with the traditional Jewish or rabbinic response, so that you'll get an understanding of the issues of the textual debate, of the interpretive debates, and see why Jews and Christians disagree about the interpretation of the Old Testament Messiah. We have already looked at two prophecies, and I think we'll move on. How would you present the continuation of the painting, the portrait that you say that you want to paint of the Messiah?
Well, the next stroke on the portrait could be a number of places. In Deuteronomy 18:15 through 19, God promises to Moses that he will raise up unto him a prophet like unto him. Well, there has been no prophet like unto Moses. It's very clear throughout the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures that no prophet arose like Moses. Now, we're either faced with the possibility that Deuteronomy 18:15 through 19 is left unfulfilled, and that prophet has not appeared yet, or we're faced with the possibility that Jesus is that prophet. The characteristics of that prophet in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 19 are that he speaks God's word, and that he is equal to Moses. And these are all claims of the New Testament, that Jesus spoke the words of his Father, and he spoke consistently with Moses, but even going a step beyond Moses. So he is the prophet, and this would fit in with this role of prophet, priest, and king. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the Deuteronomy 18 prophet.
And this is typical of you Christians, if I could say that. You do this all the time. Here's a vague prophecy. The Islamic people, the Muslims, say that this is Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad himself in the Quran says that they have hidden their book behind their backs, so as to prove or to say that I'm not truly their fulfillment and the prophet of Moses. There's nothing in this passage which we can identify and say, this is Jesus Christ.
Right, let me just respond to that, and although we're not discussing the Islamic claim, there is one fact in the passage that invalidates the Islamic claim that Muhammad is the fulfillment of this, because it says, of your own brethren I will raise up one to be a prophet. This has to be a Jewish prophet. So whatever value Muhammad has in his teaching, he can't really be the Jewish Messiah because he was not Jewish. So what this is saying is that the Jewish Messiah will be Jewish. He will be from his open people. Now,
so you've opened the door to 15 million zillion people that could have been the Messiah.
Granted, that prophecy by itself does not absolutely prove that Jesus is the Messiah. I'm just adding one more stroke to the portrait saying that Jesus is consistent with that portrait. But we're not finished yet, obviously. But obviously it invalidates any Gentile claim to be the Messiah of Israel. That is certainly true.
All right. I'll go ahead and let you just move.
Okay. Well, you know, moving out of the Torah into what Jesus called the prophets, beginning at Moses and the prophets, he expanded them and all the scriptures of things concerning himself. To tell you the truth, it's in the prophets where the message about the Messiah, to use a good 20th century term, gets heavy. It gets detailed. It's where the artists now are furiously painting in a lot of the details. Micah 5:2, for example, says that this one who actually did not have his beginning in Bethlehem would come out of Bethlehem. Where the prophet addresses Bethlehem and says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall he come forth unto me, who shall be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting." So this individual who would come out of Bethlehem, according to Micah 5:2, did not really have his beginning in Bethlehem. His goings forth were from old, from everlasting. This couldn't be David. Of course we know David came from Bethlehem, but it couldn't be David because Micah wrote 200 years after David. And also Micah 5:2 says that the one who would come out of Bethlehem existed before he came out of Bethlehem. This is consistent with the New Testament claim, not only that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and it was acknowledged by the ancient rabbis that it was a messianic prophecy, but it's consistent with the Christian claim that God sent his pre-existing Son, who existed from eternity, to come out of Bethlehem. It's interesting that Beit Lechem means the house of bread. Jesus claimed to be the bread of life. It's Bethlehem Ephratah, which is consistent. I like to say this, that the Lord not only gave the address where the Messiah would be born, he also gave a zip code. And what I mean by that is Bethlehem Ephratah. Why was Micah so specific? Because there was another Bethlehem. There's a Bethlehem up in Galilee. Joshua 19:15 says that there's a Bethlehem in the north. I want to make sure the Lord says, you know which Bethlehem. It's the Bethlehem Ephratah in Judah. And of course, anyone reading the first few chapters of Matthew is certainly aware that that is where Jesus was born in fulfillment of this prophecy.
Again, I think what we have here is you're plugging in your founding figure of your religion into the passage. Nowhere here is the word Messiah found, or the anointed one, the Mashiach. It's not found here. You have a term entitled ruler. There will be a ruler. And what this ruler is to accomplish has not happened. He's to abolish war. This one shall be called peace. But it has been far from peace. In fact, the Jewish expectation is that there will be peace. But it has even been argued that peace has not been brought, that Christianity has even brought wickedness. Didn't even Hitler, if we go back to the Holocaust, justify his hatred of the Jews by Pauline writings or by Christian understandings. There has not been peace. War has not been abolished. He has not ushered in redemption in this sense. So how can, again, you plug in Jesus as the Messiah to this passage when he has not fulfilled the things that are in it?
Tom, you bring up very good questions, and I think very appropriate responses to the Christian claim. And again, I think we're getting back to really what is the heart of the issue here. Not that Jesus fulfilled this individual prophecy or did not fulfill this individual prophecy. Is it legitimate to make the claim, as Christians do, that there's a twofold track in messianic prophecies? And if that claim is legitimate, then the Christian claim has legs to stand on. If it's not legitimate, then the Christian claim does not have legs to stand on. Now, what do I mean by a twofold track in messianic prophecies? Some prophecies speak like Deuteronomy 18, that he'll just be a prophet. They don't speak to whether he'll be reigning or suffering, granted. Other prophecies speak about him reigning, and the ones that you've mentioned there are legion. Jeremiah 23 and many of the Psalms passages speak about him as a king reigning, absolutely. And Christians accept those completely. But we also recognize that there's another track of messianic prophecies which almost speak almost contradictory to that. Instead of him being a king, instead of him reigning, instead of him putting down wars, instead of him turning the world into righteousness, this other track of Messianic prophecies speak about him being rejected and suffering and doing anything but reigning. Well, now, we Jews and Christians who accept the Scriptures are not going to say that they contradict each other. Of course not. They're consistent. Well, how can they be consistent? How can you have seemingly incompatible portraits of a sufferer and a king put together? Well, the Christian claim is what Jesus said, that the Messiah must suffer first before he reigns. And that twofold track of suffering and reigning, it can be found in the Scriptures too. And as we get to the prophets, in addition to Micah 5:2, we come to some passages that speak about him suffering, being rejected, yea, even dying. In Psalms and in Isaiah, we speak about this, the prophets speak about this whole other aspect of Messiah's reign and rule. And the objections that you keep raising, and I think that they are legitimate questions that you're raising, and they need to be addressed. The answer to that is, are Christians right in claiming that Jesus fulfilled those suffering passages and he will yet fulfill those reigning passages? That is our argument, and I think it's a valid one. When we look at those suffering passages in detail, they seem to describe what took place in what Christians call Calvary, the place of his suffering and rejection and death. And if he fulfilled those, that is the first step towards his fulfillment of the second track, those reigning passages, which we've already seen, like Micah 5. Now, Micah 5:2 actually speaks of both. Micah 5:2 speaks about his lowly, humble origin, humanly speaking. What was Bethlehem? It was just a miserable little village. Even though it was a place where David was born, it was very, very small. Small among the thousands of Judah. All right, his humble origin, but he will come forth, and eventually he will be the ruler in Israel. That's what Micah 5:2 says. So as you put that together, you can see both his humility and his reigning, both in the verse. But what we don't have in the verse is what's the time relationship between those two. The Christian claim is that the time relationship is between his first coming in the first century and his second coming, whenever that will be. We don't know.
Why don't you point us there? Why don't you point us to some suffering servants?
All right.
Paint the second path for us.
Okay, good. All right, the second track or the second aspect of that, and that's where the Christian claim really, I think, has its strongest argument. We could agree that even Jews and Christians could agree, well, he's a descendant of the woman, he's a descendant of Judah, he's a descendant of David. All those are agreed. But where do our paths depart? Right here. Psalm 22, for example, speaks about the suffering of an individual, a righteous sufferer. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, the Hebrew has. The Aramaic is Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, quoted by Jesus on the cross. It's a quotation right from Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? And as we go through Psalm 22, there are about 26 different characteristics in the psalm of the righteous sufferer there that can be identified with a crucified person. They look and stare upon my bones. My mouth is dried up as a potsherd. They part my garments. They are like animals around staring at me. Anyone familiar with the Roman method of crucifixion knows that these are characteristics of a person being crucified. And also the psalmist, the righteous sufferer, says in Psalm 22, they pierce my hands and feet, and that is consistent with the Roman method of crucifixion. Nothing that happened to David, and this is a Psalm of David, can be identified with these characteristics. Nowhere was he stripped and naked and dry and crucified and pierced. This must be an experience that David did not have. And so it looks beyond David down to the son of David, who experienced a death, a very horrible death, that is described here in great detail, including even the piercing, something that was unknown in Jewish methods of execution, but something that was used by the Romans in crucifixion.
Again, I think we're having the problem of applying. Now, I'll address First of all, again, the basic argument. Now you want to point us to the suffering servant, but if you look over to verse 27, and the ends of the world shall remember and turn to Yahweh, or to the Lord, and all the families of the nations, the Gentiles shall worship before you, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. Now I could say surely that the nations have turned, but has he restored his nation of Israel? I don't think he has. He clearly has not. And at verse 16, dogs have surrounded me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and feet. You have the word wrong. Christians do have it wrong. In the Hebrew, it is not pierced. It is like a lion. And it's a simple matter of a letter. Ka'ari, like a lion, you change the last vowel. Ka'aru, and you have pierced. And it's definitely just a Christian change. The Christians are indoctrinating themselves. It's not here in the passage.
All right, Tom, let me suggest something. There are a number of Hebrew manuscripts that do have ka'aru, they pierce. That's one thing. The standard Masoretic text, you're correct, has ka'ari. But there are a number of Hebrew manuscripts that have ka'aru. Now that should raise the question, why? Well, I think the question is answered when we realize that the ancient versions, like the Septuagint, have they pierced my hands and feet. And the Septuagint was a Greek translation, I might say a pre-Christian Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and they must have had in front of them a Hebrew manuscript that said ka'aru, they pierced, or else they would not have translated it with the clear Greek translation, they pierced. So I would suggest that an ancient reading of this passage was they pierced, because both these Hebrew manuscripts preserve that reading, the Septuagint preserves that reading, and it's consistent with the entire passage. Let me suggest something to you, Tom, for our Jewish friends that do not want to accept my argument there. Still, the verse has to have the idea of something being added to it. Let me suggest this. In verse 16, if the Jewish argument is valid, here's the way it would go. Like a lion, my hands and feet. You have to provide something there. Like a lion, my hands and feet does not make sense, okay? You have to provide something. Why not provide, like a lion, they tore at my hands and feet. Like a lion, they pierced my hands and feet. By itself, it simply doesn't make sense in the Masoretic text. Like a lion, my hands and feet. So why not suggest that like a lion, they attacked or they pierced my hands and feet, and it still is a valid understanding, even from the Jewish point of view.
If I grant you that, and we even grant the similarities of the crucifixion account, why could this not just be of David? Why cannot this just be? David often says things like this when he had sinned with Bathsheba and he covered himself with sackcloth. He says, "My bones are aching." That was typical phraseology of David when he was grieving and mourning because of his own sin. And the nations would see often in the travails of the nation of Israel, as they would win the battles, the Gentile nations would fear them because their reputation would go before them. And so this can clearly easily be explained simply as a Psalm of David, without a messianic expectation. There's no word in this entire Psalm which says Messiah.
This is true, because there are only a few references in the Bible, specific references to the word Messiah as describing this future individual. Very few, as a matter of fact. Psalm 2 and Daniel 9 are the only ones. But the doctrine of the Messiah is not limited to the use of that word Mashiach. And I think everyone would agree with that, Jew and Christian alike. What we're talking about is a coming deliverer. He's called by a number of names. He's called a prophet, he's called a priest, he's called a king, he's called God's Son, and he's called the Messiah. So even though the word Messiah is not here, this is talking about an individual, a righteous sufferer, who seems to be rejected by his father at the very time of his need. But the argument that it's David is a valid one, except for one point. There are so many details here that cannot be identified in the life of David. So many details. Only a few can really be identified with what we know about him running from Saul and his life as a refugee in 1 Samuel 21 through 30. The degree of this is not really applicable to the life of David. And then secondly, the redemptive aspect of this and the effect of his suffering and how it's going to reach to the world has no application to the life of David either. Like you said in verses 22 through the end of the psalm, there's this effect that his suffering is going to have on the nations. David's rejection and suffering and exile had no redemptive effect on the nations, but Jesus did. And what Jesus said is, before verses 27 through 29 are fulfilled, when all of the world believes in him and peace comes and the kingdom comes, before that, he must suffer. And that is what we're saying, that before the last part of the psalm is fulfilled in the Messiah's kingdom and reign, the first part of the psalm is fulfilled in his suffering.
Yeah, it's hard not to argue that the Psalm 22 has a very vivid crucifixion account, that it's hard to ignore the parallels with the two. But still, it's not definitive. It's not definitive.
Well, let's go further.
Let's go further.
Let's go further. If we really get right to the...
Actually, before we go,
okay.
let me say this. You still have not, with as many strokes as you've painted, you have not shown any particular passage which unequivocally says Jesus Christ on a passage.
Tom, if I could do that, if I could point to one passage here that in very clear letters says this is Jesus Christ, we would not be having this discussion. Because our Jewish friends would see that, read it, and say, oh, this is Jesus Christ. It's clear, it's unequivocal, there's no doubt about it. We would not be having this discussion. The reason we're having this discussion is that many Jewish people, and I should say not all, but many Jewish people have not seen in Jesus the fulfillment of these messianic prophecies. Now that's for a couple of reasons. There are many Jewish people, and maybe some of our viewers may be among them, who aren't aware of these messianic prophecies. And many Jewish people, when they are confronted with them, come to believe in them. Just recently I was talking with a Jewish lawyer. I knew that his mind was trained legally, and I gave him Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. His first response to me after reading it is that the guy is building a very strong case. Now, for the first time in this very intelligent young Jewish man's life, he's a lawyer, graduate of a university here in the LA area. He is being confronted with solid evidence. Now, is that because he's ignorant? Is that because he's not intelligent? No, he's a very intelligent young man. It's just he had never really been exposed to these arguments and these messianic prophecies. So that's one reason why Jewish people may not be, or that we're having this discussion and Jewish people haven't believed this, is many of them have never really been exposed to it. And my hope and prayer is that in a few weeks that Jewish lawyer is going to call me back and we're going to be talking further, and he's going to see that the evidence that demands a verdict that Jesus is the Messiah demands a verdict, yes, he is the Messiah. Because while it's not just one verse that screams out, Jews in the Old Testament, Jesus is the Messiah, we're building a case here. And the case, I think, is a valid one. It's a cumulative one, and it's a one that can't be ignored. Now, as we get to what probably is the one passage that has convinced more Jewish people of Jesus' Messiahship than any other, we get to the suffering servant passages of Isaiah. And if you're asking for one, Tom, that is the clearest of all, Isaiah 53 would be it. Isaiah 53 is the culmination of a series of servant songs in the book of Isaiah. While some have viewed the servant as speaking about Isaiah himself, there are some early servant songs where you could point that out. Isaiah is the servant himself. Others have argued that in some of the servant songs that the nation of Israel is the servant. And granted, in Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 43, you could make that point. But as the development of the servant songs goes through Isaiah, once we get to Isaiah 49, the next to the last of the servant songs, we see that the servant clearly distinguishes himself from Israel. And he is going to be one who is going to bring Israel back to the Lord. Isaiah 49:5 says, "Now the Lord says, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel is gathered to him. Here, in the development of the servant songs, the ideal servant is one who is not Israel and who is not Isaiah the prophet, but is one who will bring Israel back to the Lord through his suffering servant activity. Now that moves into the last of the servant songs, Isaiah 53, and we could probably do no better than simply to read the center part of Isaiah 53 and let somebody answer the question, well, who do you think it's describing? Allow me to read Isaiah 53, 3 and following. He's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. He's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we, that is Israel, did esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. And then here in verse 6, which some have called like the central verse of the Hebrew Scriptures, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, that is the servant, the iniquity of us all. So here, Israel is crying out in the song about this servant, and they say the Lord put our iniquity on him. In other words, there's a redemptive role that he has, a substitutionary role of bearing the sins of Israel. Now we know it's Israel because later on it says, for the transgression of my people was he stricken. So he is stricken for the sins of Isaiah's people. My people, he says. This is Israel. So this one is stricken for Israel. He can't be identified with Israel, as identical with Israel, or how could he be suffering for Israel? How could he be the one who is redemptively bringing Israel back to God? So here, I think, is probably the clearest. And I understand why. I have talked to many Jewish people who have said that it's Isaiah 53 that was the clincher, that was the censure, that brought them to faith in Jesus as Messiah.
I've studied the arguments against this, and I have a hard time responding. If I want to argue Israel, then I come in again to the point of this person was afflicted for the nation. I've heard it still argued as a nation, and it's difficult for me even to carry it out.
In certain Jewish texts and certain Jewish traditions, this has been viewed as the Messiah. I understand that the standard Jewish interpretation today is Israel. And since Rashi, the great Bible exegete of the 12th century, popularized the interpretation that Israel is the Messiah here, Israel is the servant here, that's been the standard Jewish interpretation. But there's plenty of evidence that prior to Rashi, like in the Talmud and in the Midrash, quotations from Isaiah 53 by the rabbis were clearly identifying it with the Messiah prior to Rashi. So a case can be made that it's a standard Jewish interpretation as well, at least prior to the 12th century, that while they may not have agreed that it was Jesus who was being spoken about here, we can cite text after text after text in the Talmud and the Midrash saying that Isaiah 53 was referring to the Messiah. Now, if that acknowledgement is made, then who qualifies? And again, to follow up on our discussion earlier, Tom, how does this fit in with a reigning, a king?
That was my response. No, we have you're painting a picture. The Scripture is painting a picture that you're presenting of Messiah, and each stroke is adding to a picture that you claim portrays Jesus. And this is like a tear in the page, a removing of the middle, saying. King, reign, restore the nation, destroy Satan, destroy evil, cut him out, be the king, bring peace. And here we have the removal of sin, an atonement for the sin of the nation. Because the removal of the sin from the sinner must take place before the Messiah reigns outwardly. And of course, it's an inward cleansing. It's a redemption that is inward that must take place before a redemption that is outward. Our Jewish friends often speak about, you Christians speak about redemption. When Jews speak about redemption, it's outward, it's national, it means restoration of Israel. We as Christians agree with that, but we believe that it's the final stage of the redemption. Before that final outward
redemption takes place, when Israel is brought back to the land, something I believe with all of my heart, and the prophetic significance of Israel's returning to the land is something very dear to me. But before that takes place, there must be a spiritual inward redemption, that the Messiah comes and provides for us. And He is wounded, He's bruised, He bears our sins. And this is what Jesus was saying. He was not saying to His disciples, you are wrong in thinking that the Messiah will reign. He says to His disciples, it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer, then to enter into His glory. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, He explained to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning Himself. And I would say to our Jewish friends, the argument does not rest on this individual verse or that individual verse. The argument rests on taking all these verses together and what is the best solution to the one who fits the portrait. And I would say that there appeared in the first century an individual who fits the portrait of a suffering Messiah, and who fits the portrait genealogically of a descendant of Judah and of David, born in Bethlehem. And even Psalm 16, David says that someday he'll rise from the dead. He did that as well. And so I would say he has fulfilled all of these prophecies. Ought we not to expect him eventually to fulfill the rest of the reigning prophecies? That would be my argument.
If the argument is so sure and sound, why didn't the apostles understand or expect it? Even Peter, when Jesus was talking to him, Peter said, may it never be that you suffer. He didn't understand this. This was a delusional understanding of Jesus.
It's a very appropriate response, Tom, and it probably has to have an explanation against the culture of the time. The Jews were downtrodden. The Jews were under the heel of Rome. They were no longer reigning as an independent state. They were under Rome. So it probably, there's something psychological here too. You know, if you're an oppressed people, prophecies of a suffering Messiah may not be as attractive as prophecies of a reigning Messiah. A Messiah who will come and defeat your enemies and give you freedom have a much greater attraction. Okay, you follow me? Mm-hmm. So my response to that is, during a time of oppression and suffering that the Jewish people were in, or the heel of Rome, the prophecies about a suffering Messiah may have just sort of been put to the side because we want one who's going to come and knock the heads of the Romans and give us freedom. I would think that that would be the explanation. And it took them a long time to see how Jesus' rejection and suffering actually was a fulfillment of the prophecies. But when they did, Tom, they gave their lives for that message. They recognized that it all came together when they saw Jesus die and rise again. It all came together, it fits, and they became so convinced of it, they gave their lives for it.
But this whole concept of forgiveness and redemption doesn't go along with typical Judaic thinking. In Judaism, your forgiveness comes by action. It's even as James argues in the New Testament, salvation by works. Our works is what justifies us before God. And yet here in Christianity, in the supposed Jesus teaching of the Messiah, you have murderers and rapists that on a simple confession of faith are forgiven. Yet that conflicts with Judaic principle of salvation.
But yet embedded even within the Hebrew Scriptures is this teaching that blood must be shed for inward cleansing. Leviticus 17, 10 and 11 says, I have given you the blood upon the altar, and it shall make atonement for your souls. So it's not just an outward reformation that secures your forgiveness. It's an inward cleansing by blood. And also, even on the Day of Atonement, in Leviticus 23, the Jewish people were told, afflict your souls. Afflict your souls. So there is an emphasis that there must be something inward that results in the forgiveness of my sins. It's not just outward. Now, the Christian position is, when we're inwardly forgiven and cleansed, it manifests itself in our deeds. And readers of the New Testament will recognize when I'm talking about the faith works matter, that having come to faith, we manifest works. Someone has said, faith is the root of salvation, works are the fruit of salvation. And having come to faith and being inwardly cleansed, we are to manifest that in righteous living and righteous deeds.
How is this? Why don't you also just discuss how this atonement is supposed to work? Let's pull this to a close, did you want to go over, you have on the note here, Isaiah 7. Did you want to touch on Isaiah 7?
Well, we could. Isaiah 7:14 speaks about a child that will be born. There's a big debate as to the meaning of the word virgin there, Alma. Our Jewish friends say that Alma, is simply a young woman, and it's not virgin. But Isaiah 7:14 use of Alma is consistent with the other Old Testament uses of Alma. All 6 other references refer to an unmarried woman who is a virgin, the most famous being Genesis 24:43, Rebecca. It's used of Rebecca, who was a virgin. So it's consistent with the use of Alma in other passages to translate it as virgin, and that must be seen as part of a bigger picture. In Isaiah 7 through 9, we see the prophecy about a child who will come, who will have divine characteristics. He will be called Emmanuel, God with us. In Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, or 5 and 6 in the Hebrew text, he's called the Mighty God. He's called the Prince of Peace. He's called Wonderful Counselor, and yet he's a son. So how do you put together this divine human one? Well, we see it as put together in the incarnation, and that Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy of this Messiah's birth. So that's his credentials, but his work is providing redemption and forgiveness for Israel.
And I want to ask one final question as we go, without responding to Isaiah 7. I think, if the Jews, if Jesus is the Messiah for the Jews, then why have the Jews rejected him? What is God doing? Why has he brought the Messiah to his people and not and have them all reject him?
The first few generations of the Christian church were almost exclusively all Jewish. So to say that Jews didn't receive the Messiah is not accurate either. I mean, for the first generation, the vast majority of Christians were Jewish believers. They were called Nazarenes. So that's one point, that Jews did respond to him. Sadly, and we must acknowledge this as part of the larger Christian movement in the world today, the so-called, I say the church's treatment, because it wasn't true Christians' treatment of the Jews, has been less than exemplary. Throughout the Middle Ages, oftentimes it was the church, the institutional church, that treated Jews horribly. That does not endear the Christian gospel to Jewish people when you're being hounded and persecuted and exiled. I say that not proudly as part of the Christian tradition. I say that as a shame that those were people in the Middle Ages who were not acting according to Christ. So I think, sadly, that the so-called Christian treatment or church treatment of the Jewish people has turned Jews off to the gospel. And only as they see us behaving as Jesus taught, to be meek and to be compassionate and to be loving and not persecuting them, will they ever find any legitimacy in our message. So oftentimes it's been we ourselves who have turned off Jews to the Christian message.
I hope that presents you with some understanding of the issues of Jesus as fulfillment of the Old Testament. Hopefully you'll have gotten understanding after this of the various passages that are interpreted and how they would relate to the person of Jesus or the Messiah of the Old Testament. I encourage you at home to take a look at these. Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and going from the beginning, Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 49, Deuteronomy 18, and Micah 5, and put them together as a portrait, as a painting, as Dr. Varner has established, that each one is a brushstroke of description as to a person, and the whole picture cannot be seen until the last brushstroke is painted in. And see for yourself whether the painting will paint the picture of Jesus of Nazareth or not. Thank you for watching. This is Christianity on Trial. I'm Tom DeVartagnan. Thank you for joining us.